Welcome to Mokena's Front Porch, a Mokena history podcast with Matt Galik and me, Israel Smith. So thank you all for coming out. This was a lot of fun. It's something Matt and I have talked about. We did some other video tours of Pioneer Cemetery, as well as we walked through Marshall Cemetery. And so when it came to St. Mary's, it thought it'd be a good opportunity because people were just saying like, hey, we'd love to, come along and be part of this, and put it out there, and had a good response. So we appreciate that. I think Matt's got a lot of great information. We're thankful to St. Mary's and Father Dindo and that for giving us the blessings. Matt has been studying Mokena's history since, 12 years old?
Yeah, or thereabouts, yeah.
And,
yep.
You think about the historians typically that a town has, it usually takes till somebody's up in their older years to start to realize the importance of the history. And so they have that limited, time of researching and discovering more about their area of interest, where Matt has, now already put more years into discovering and researching Mokena's history than most people that take up history are even able to. With multiple books and the blog and the newspaper articles, he's an extremely helpful wealth of information, and his work being passed down to the generations behind us is going to be invaluable. The people that care about the history are the ones that are going to be the ones that care about the future. So really happy that Matt was willing to do this.
Yeah.
We started the blog or the podcast coming up on 2 years ago now in October. And it's just been a great experience, a great way to get information out to the community that just don't know the history of Mokena and its rich history. It's a history that's repeated all over the country. Small towns that are built up through trains or a road coming through or Route 66 or whatever it is. And our history is what makes up the wider, broader history of our country. So I'm excited about what Matt's put together for us, and now I'll step back and let him run the show.
Israel introduced me, so you guys, there's a lot of familiar faces here, but now we all know each other. Let's walk over into the historic part of the cemetery. We'll talk a little about how the church came to be founded and then how the cemetery came to be founded before we go out into the historic part of the cemetery to get to know some of the very, very, very interesting people that are here. A quick fact, there are over 800 people interred in these grounds. And every single one of them, no matter how old they were when they passed, has a life story. And they're all are interesting, and we're only going to get to meet just a handful of them today. But every single person here has an interesting story behind them. And as I was just saying before the tour started, it was really hard to kind of whittle down who I was going to talk about to make this manageable time length. But in any case, yes, if you follow me, we'll walk over, kind of over by the church, and we'll talk about the beginnings and all that stuff first. Well, right this way, guys. We'll kind of take a little walk here. Okay. Once again, can everybody hear me okay? I'm really concerned that, okay, good, that people won't be able to hear me. So, to talk about this St. Mary's Cemetery, of course, we have to talk about the beginnings of the church. St. Mary's German Catholic Church. To get the best understanding, let us go back to the year 1860. All the way back to 1860. Mokena is a new village at that point. It was not yet incorporated, but it was a little village about 8 years old. The Rock Island Railroad had only been here for 8 years, and it was an exceedingly small place. There were a good amount of folk who lived here who were born or came from what is today Germany. The patchwork of kingdoms and dukedoms and municipalities that made up what we now know as the country of Germany, what wasn't a unified country yet at that point. So good amount, maybe even most of the people were of Germanic origin around here. And of them, they were a very pious lot, and the vast majority of them were evangelical Lutheran, and would go on to found their own congregation, their own church, the German United Evangelical St. John's Church in 1862, which still exists in town today as St. John's. Of course, not everybody was evangelical Lutheran. There were a lot of Americans, too, who lived in Mokena, whose family had been in the country for centuries. They were mostly Methodists, some Baptists in there, and in time, before the decade was out, they would also form their own congregations in town as well, which left the Catholics. There was a Catholic minority. It was not a particularly huge group of people, but they had their own spiritual needs, of course, as well. So there was a family of Prussian farmers, the Enderses. The patriarch and matriarch were Matthias and Margaret Enders. And their homestead was right in this general vicinity, kind of over on the other side of the trees where the Brown House is nowadays. They lived somewhere in that general vicinity. Not in that house. That house only dates from the first few years of the 20th century. But before then, we had the Enderses, and they were faithful Catholics. And in February of 1860, they donated a tract of their property, upon which we are now standing, to the Bishop of the Catholic Church of Chicago. Because they were already thinking then they want to have their own church in Mokena, and they wanted to sort of get the ball rolling on this, so donated this little piece of land to the bishop in Chicago. And of course, we know 1860, towards the end of that year, Abraham Lincoln is elected president. The Civil War is only a few months away from breaking out. It was a very tumultuous time in American history. And here and there, by and by, the local Catholics are kind of raising money, setting money aside to get their own church founded. One of the ways they did this was by hosting a few balls in Joliet. Getting some money raised to get the Catholic Church started. By 1864, everything was ready to go, and a master carpenter, craftsman by the name of Bernard Fulman was hired to build the church for the Mokena Catholics. And thus is his handiwork right there. Cost the congregation about $1,400 to build the church. All of the timber, the lumber used in the building was sourced from local forests, and the windowsills were made from black walnut. And I can show you a picture of what the church, St. Mary's, looked like right around the time it was built. I'll bring this around so everybody can see it. This is the oldest known photograph of Mokena, taken about 1870. And that's St. Mary's right there. Looks much as it does today. This is the village schoolhouse, first schoolhouse. That's the Methodist church, and that's St. John's. And there's St. Mary's. Picture taken about 1870. So oldest known photograph of Mokena. That's St. Mary's right there, yep. Gotcha. Absolutely. What this picture is showing is what was called the public square, or the public grounds. of Mokena. It was an area of a few acres that was set aside by village father Alan Denny as a place just for schools and, whoop, there's a bee right there, just for schools and churches. St. Mary's was a little outside, was a little north of the public square. So that's why it's kind of in the background right there. So when St. Mary's was founded, the parish was made up of 9 families. We'll get to know a few of them today. The first priest to hold services here in Mokena was a man by the name of Father Peter Fassbender, and he is a mystery man in the history of Mokena because after being on his trail for more than 20 years, never been able to find a single thing about him other than his name. We don't know where he came from. It sounds like he was German, as his congregation was mostly Germans, but don't know how old he was, where he came from. He did not live in Mokena. He came to town every few weeks to hold his services. And so over the years, St. Mary's grew, although very, very, very slowly. The parish didn't really have an explosion of growth until after the Second World War, until after the town started growing more. But services were held here in our little church all the way up on a regular basis until the 1950s. So it was about 90 years of regular usage. And luckily the church has been saved and was restored back in the 1970s. It's also a very, very kind of long and interesting story. And also I should say, St. Mary's, as we got into that time frame after World War II and in that area, was considered the mother Catholic church for this part of Will County, being considered the mother church to is that St. Peter's in Frankfurt, the Catholic church in Frankfurt, St. Peter's, and also to St. Jude's in New Lenox. So St. Mary's had, once upon a time, had some standing. But, of course, to go back to the founding days, they had their churchyard here, which the congregation set aside for use as a cemetery. The first time the ground was broken here was in September of 1865, just a few months after the war, the Civil War ended, and a few months after the president was murdered, to accept the earthly remains of a man by the name of John Schmidt. Once again, a mystery man. We don't know how old he was, where he came from, who his family was, although in all likelihood, he was a family member of some way, shape, or form of the founding Schmidt family. The Schmidts were one of those 9 families that made up the founding of St. Mary's. But we'll talk a little more about them in just a little bit here. But if you want to come in this way a little more and gather around this plot right here, grab some water here if I can find there we go. Okay. Oh, and the sun is shining just perfectly on this monument here. We're standing now in the family plot of the Enders family, without Patriarch Matthias Enders and his wife, Matriarch Margaret Enders, who is in this plot here. The St. Mary's Parish, as we know it today, would not exist. They are the founding mother and founding father of St. Mary's in Mokena. As I mentioned, they were of Prussian origin, the Kingdom of Prussia, which nowadays would correspond basically to northern Germany and western Poland. Though they were ethnic Germans, spoke German, so on and so forth. They were farmers. They settled here towards the end of the 1840s. So there were people of European birth, of American birth, who lived in what we would now call Mokena at the time. The Potawatomi were mostly gone by this time. But the life that the Enders family knew as they settled right over there, having acquired their property in 1847, was an extremely hard one. They were tough, rough-hewn pioneers, and their life would be completely foreign to us. As time went on, Matthias, that's the German form of Matthew, became the church's sexton, which meant that he took care of the cemetery, was in charge of maintaining it, selling off the plots, so on and so forth. And he met kind of a tragic end in the 1880s. 1887, he was out with his horse-drawn wagon, hauling a load of lumber, and a gust of wind came and blew his hat off. And as he went to go grab his hat, somehow he fell out of his seat and broke his neck. And thus, that's how he died, and he was interred here in the family plot at St. Mary's. His wife, Margaret, and this is a very, there's no other way to say it, just kind of a weird gravestone, because it says father, but if you come around and look on the other end, upside down, you can see Margaret Enders' name and her dates of birth and death. So I have no idea what the story is behind this gravestone and why part of it is upside down and on the other end, I don't know. But Margaret Enders outlived her husband by quite a lot. At some point after Matthias died, she moved to Joliet to live with some of her children. And here, this is a flyer. Oops. This is a flyer from the auction that was held on the Enders farm after Matthias passed away. And you can see sort of the interesting stuff that they're selling, like 8 head of cattle, various carts, buggies, things like that. The auction was cried by Colonel Moriarty, Charles Moriarty, who was a very well-known auctioneer at the time. And if you are a fan of the podcast, you'll know that name because he's come up a few times. Just a flyer from the Enders sale when it happened. But as I said, Margaret moved to Joliet to be with her children, and as the years went on, she got older and older and older. Here she is in the beginning of the 20th century. And as she got up in age, she kind of got to be something like a Will County celebrity. Every time she hit a big birthday, there would be a write-up about her in the Joliet papers. That's where this picture came from, actually. And as she got well into her 90s, her vision started to fail, but she still was an avid sewer. She liked to sew rags. She could sew by touch. She had no problems going up and down stairs. And people would ask her what her secret was. And she said, first of all, was not to worry. And her second one, she was a tried and true believer of the old adage, early to bed, early to rise. Mrs. Enders went to bed around 8 o'clock every night and got up at 5 in the morning. Also, as she got older, was kind of getting up to the 100 mark, her family very carefully kept away news of World War I from her. They didn't want her to get concerned about it, as the country of her birth was one of the major powers fighting the war. In any case, she finally passed away in 1916, was brought back here to Mokena to be interred in the family plot. Now, when she died, the Joliet papers said that she was 102. And that was accepted at the time, and that's even what's on her gravestone here. Although, I kind of wonder about that. No matter what, she was very advanced in age. However, if you examine census records of the Enders family, and as you'll know, if you've ever done any kind of genealogical or historical research, census records are like the foundation of doing research on ordinary people. A census, of course, is conducted every 10 years. In every federal census that Margaret Enders appeared, her date of birth was logged as being somewhere in the 1820s. Never the same year, oddly enough, but it was always somewhere in the 1820s. So which leads me to believe that she probably was just in her 90s when she died, which is still nothing to sneeze at. That's still an accomplishment. And it's also kind of the same with her husband, Matthias. So on his marker here, on his monument, it would indicate a birth date of, once again, being in the 1820s at some point. But same thing, census records throughout his life, 1850, 60, 70, 80, put him closer to the 18 teens right around the time of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. So I think what we have is Matthias was made younger when he died, for whatever reason, we don't know, and his wife Margaret, her age was inflated quite a lot. Why? Who knows? We'll never know. But that's the Enders family. Without them, there would be no St. Mary's of Mokena, period. Founding mother, founding father. If you'll follow me, we're going to go just over here, over into the Smith plot, where there's a very interesting Mokenaian I want you all to get to know. So if you follow me, please. Give everybody a chance to get settled in over here. I'm so happy with the weather today. There's not a cloud in the sky, and the sun is really helping us by shining just fantastically on all these old monuments. We can really read them perfectly today. So let's see. Okay. So here where we're standing, or where I'm standing right here, this is the family plot of the George and Anna Smith family. And George Smith, who was born in 1838, was a part of the founding Schmidt family, one of the founding 9 families, the Schmidts. He was the only one of his family, as he came to America with his brothers towards the end of the 1850s when he was a very young man. He was the only one that Americanized his name. All the others stayed Schmidts of Mokena, but George went and took Smith as his name. But George Smith was born in a tiny little village in what is today Western Germany called Damflos. As I said, as a young man, he's about 19 years old, came to America, found his way to Mokena with his brothers, which then was just a tiny little railroad hamlet. And George Smith got himself a job working for the Rock Island Railroad, as a lot of the folk who lived in Mokena did, working as what was called a section hand, which was just like a laborer on the railroad. And it was with the Rock Island that George Smith would spend his whole career for the rest of his life. He worked his way up the Rock Island, the ladder at the Rock Island, and before he passed away, had become a foreman on the railroad. But what's really interesting about George Smith is that he was of the generation that fought the Civil War. He was a veteran himself, and his life is a celebration of a life lived in bravery. This is a man who did not know the meaning of fear. He volunteered for the Union Army, mustered in 1861, the year the war started, just a young man in his 20s, was mustered into Company B of the 20th Illinois Volunteer Infantry, which gained a fair amount of its recruitment from here in Will County, saw hard action throughout the course of the war, stared the enemy in the face, fought at the battles of Shiloh, Siege of Vicksburg, the Atlanta campaign. I can show you a picture, or an artist's conception of what the Battle of Shiloh looked like, where George Smith was. I'll bring him around here. That's Shiloh, Tennessee, April 1862. And for his patriotism, George Smith paid dearly. Over the course of the war, he was wounded 4 separate times. Once a rebel ball passed through the meaty part of his leg, did not hit the bone, luckily. Had the ball hit his bone, he would have lost the leg. Another one took off a few of his fingers on one of his hands. He had another wound in the shoulder that I think when he got it, he must have been laying, because the ball went through his shoulder, traveled once again through the fleshy part of his arm, and exited out his elbow. And most seriously, he suffered a head wound in which the ball struck him just at the base of the nose and lodged above the roof of his mouth. And he carried that for the rest of his life. It caused him a tremendous amount of never-ending pain. On certain days when the weather was bad, he would really feel it acutely. He even told his neighbors that if he moved his head a certain way, he could feel the ball move too above the roof of his mouth. And that is what eventually led to his death in 1903, George Smith. So he did not die on the battlefield, but a wound suffered decades earlier is what contributed to that. I should mention his wife's name was Anna. Anna Sonnenberg was her maiden name, and they got married in 1864, the last year of the war. Together, they had 13 children, of which I think it was about 7 of them made it to adulthood. And some of their children are here in the family plot with them. The Smiths lived in a few different places in Mokena. Towards the end of his life, George and Anna Smith owned some property on 3rd Street, just a little ways, let's see, that would be east of Wolf Road on the north side of the street. So if this foliage wasn't here, we could look right over into where George Smith's property was and where he lived. So a very brave man. There are many, many profoundly brave people and veterans interred in this cemetery, of which there's another one that I like to highlight that actually has a lot in common with George Smith, but was of a much different generation, and he is just right here. Let's see. Here he is, right here. We don't have to move that much. Joseph Hayden. And like I said, he had a lot in common with George Smith, as he also was German-born, born in 1899, so quite a bit younger than George Smith, not of the same generation. Came to America with his family when he was a really, really little kid. So I don't even know how much he would have remembered of his life in Germany before he came to America. But lived in Chicago, and during World War I, Joseph Hayden served in the Marine Corps. And he made it to France, where the war was going on, and like what would have been his neighbor, saw a lot of hard fighting. He was, this might have been a tall tale, but it was said that Mr. Hayden, Joseph Hayden, was part of what was called the Lost Battalion. If you are a history buff, military history buff, you will have heard of the Lost Battalion. This was a group of American soldiers towards the end of the war, the last months of the war, 1918, who got cut off from the rest of their comrades and basically sat and were massacred by the Germans, had no supplies, had to crawl under gunfire to a creek to get water. At one point were being shelled by their comrades, their own side. Very, very serious stuff. And it was said that Joseph Hayden was there, that he was part of the Lost Battalion. The only reason I say, okay, maybe this is a tall tale is because if you do even just the most cursory research on it, that was an Army unit, and as we know, Mr. Hayden was a Marine. So, but he could have been there though. In any case, he was in hard action. He was gassed at one point. He and did get medals for bravery from the French government for taking part in the liberation of their country. After the war ended, in the 1920s, he married a Mokena girl by the name of Agnes Frisch. She and her family lived just up the street here in a historic 2-story white house that stands right at the curve of the road. House is still there. That was the Frisch homestead. And later on, the Haydens moved in and lived there as well. Mr. Hayden worked on the Board of Trade in Chicago, and once World War II got started, he taught civil defense classes. So very patriotic man, always very modest. He never really talked about his experiences in World War I, was very reserved, never really made a big deal about it, never really liked to talk it up. As I mentioned, one of the other things he has in common with George Smith is that Joseph Hayden died as a result of his injuries that he got in the war, having passed away not too long after New Year's 1943 as a result of the gassing he had suffered back in 1918. And the day of his funeral in Mokena was absolutely terrible winter weather. Snow, wind, ice. Hardly anybody could make it to the funeral here in the church. It was planned to be a military funeral, but most of the William Martin post of the VFW physically couldn't make it to the church. Only 2 of their members succeeded in getting here, fellow World War I veterans Fred Hench and Fred Steinhagen. So they managed to do as best as they could with what they had that day. And one of Joseph Hayden's cousins was a Catholic priest who had made it to town just in time to also conduct the funeral for him here at St. Mary's. So that's the story of Joseph Hayden, another veteran, or 2 veterans, George Smith, Joseph Hayden, both of different generations from each other, but still a lot in common. I'd like to show you one last veteran today before we continue on, and he's once again right over here just on the other side of the road, so I will lead us right over there and we'll get to know him as well. Okay, so this marks the earthly remains of Henry Fulman, who was born in 1845. And the Fulmans were, like the Enderses and the Schmidts, a family who breathed St. Mary's and its history, as Henry's father was Bernard Fulman, the man I mentioned a little earlier on, who was the carpenter who built the church. So the Fulmans' beginnings before they got to Mokena in the 1850s, they're kind of nebulous. It's not really 100% clear where exactly they came from. It looks like Henry's father, Master Carpenter Bernard, looks like he was from Luxembourg, and then it looks like he had migrated into Belgium where he started his family, and thus it appears that Henry was of Belgian birth, but came to America, came to Mokena when he was still a pretty little kid. And once again, Henry Fulman, as he was born in 1845, was a member of that Civil War generation. In 1864, the 3rd year of the war, Henry, like his neighbor George Smith, volunteered to take up arms and serve in the Union Army. He was mustered into the same regiment that George Smith was, the 20th Illinois. He was sent to a brand new company of the unit that had been formed that fall of 1864, to sort of replenish the losses that the 20th had suffered over those past few years. And there were lots of local men who fought in that, or who took part in that company, in that unit. They were kind of representing who was still left at that point, as the new company was made up mostly of very, very young guys, like Henry Fulman. He was 19 when he enlisted, and men that were well into their middle age at that point. So Henry Fulman's experience in the Civil War would have looked a lot different than George Smith's, as he came along, Henry Fulman did, relatively late in the war, and he would have just seen things like guard duty, stuff like this. I don't really, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't really think that Henry and his comrades in this new company really saw any action. But that's not to diminish their role in what they did. He and his comrades still volunteered to take up arms against a rebellion that was tearing the country apart. So he should be commended for that, absolutely. As the war ended, less than a year later, Henry Fulman came back to Mokena. He married Elizabeth Enders. So his in-laws were, Henry Fulman's parents-in-law were Matthias and Margaret Enders. And that's why he rests here where he does with his wife, still very close to the Enders plot, as the rest of the Fulmans are buried further this way, further east, into the cemetery. So he rests with his wife's family. But Henry Fulman conducted an inn in Mokena in the 1870s. Doesn't look like he really did that too terribly long, because by the 1880s he had moved to the county seat, to Joliet, where he had become a glazier, and then eventually followed in his father's footsteps by becoming a carpenter. And got to be fairly old, passed away in 1924, brought back to the family plot of his in-laws in Mokena, and buried here at St. Mary's. But I would like to draw attention to the condition of his gravestone here. I have a picture I took, and granted, this is an old picture. This is from about 20 years ago. I was pretty young when I took this picture, but that's what Henry Fulman's grave used to look like. And sometime around Memorial Day, this cylindrical part of the monument right here was toppled from its base and rolled about 10 feet over this way by this gravestone here that says Balsamo. So I decorate his and George Smith's graves every Memorial Day, and I managed to roll this back up here to be with its base, but I can't lift it. I was hoping to get it back here or to even out the base and get it repaired, but alas, I couldn't do it myself. Something else that's pretty alarming about Henry Fulman's grave is you'll notice in this picture there used to be an iron star on his grave. And what that is, it's a holder for a flag. And these were placed on the graves of Civil War veterans by an organization called the Grand Army of the Republic. Had likely been here since Henry Fulman passed in the 1920s. The Grand Army of the Republic, or the G.A.R., was a fraternal organization made up of Union veterans of the Civil War. It was a group that Henry Fulman was a member of, as was George Smith, and I thought it was so cool that this original marker from the G.A.R. had lasted so long and still marked his grave after so many years, as there's not a lot of them left anymore over the years. And once again, around the same time the marker here was vandalized, the flag holder from the G.A.R. was stolen. So it's no longer here. I have a suspect, but alas, yeah, we can't do anything about it. So I'm glad I have this picture to show what his grave used to look like, and hopefully we can do something to fix this marker. As yes, Kate.
I just wondered, what do you think it would take?
Yeah.
Anybody have an idea? Well, what's it going to take to get that back up there? Just, I don't know,
Yeah.
9 or 20 guys?
Yeah, I don't know. I'd imagine maybe a few guys could lift it, but then the problem is you kind of notice that the base is kind of uneven. Not that I think it would just fall off on its own, but it would be very easy just to topple once again. So I almost wonder if the base itself would have to be evened out. Yeah, because there are groups of people that specialize in fixing and restoring historic gravestones. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight Henry Fulman, to draw attention to this, as I don't think the condition of his grave is in accordance with a man who did and sacrificed what he did in our country's greatest moment of emergency. So, but that's the grave of Henry Fulman, and a little more about his family. Let us continue. Got a few more people to talk about still. We'll just go this way a little bit more, over into a pretty interesting plot with some really interesting Mokenaians. Okay, so right now, this general area right here, this is the family plot of the Schubert family. Once again, you guessed it, one of the original 9 families of St. Mary's. Right here in this general vicinity repose patriarch and matriarch Andreas and Margaret Schubert, both born in the early 1800s in what is today northern Bavaria. The family hailed from a little village called Wolfersgrün, and towards the end of the 1840s, they were in 1847, 48, so Mokena does not exist yet. The Rock Island Railroad does not exist yet. It's just open prairie with little farms carved out by pioneers, people with very sturdy constitutions. The Schubert family came to what would become Mokena. And by the time of the Civil War, so by the time the church was established, they had become pretty successful and owned a farm of a pretty decent size on what is today 191st Street. Let's see, just east of the intersection with today's Route 45. So you got Denny's over there, there's that little strip mall. That was right where the Schubert homestead was and all their acreage. Pretty impressive monument here for Andreas and Margaret. Andreas passed away in 1889, was interred here. Margaret went to live with their adult children in Chicago. She passed away in the early 1900s, like so many, returned to Mokena, put in the family plot. Anybody that's familiar or has listened to a lot of our podcast or is well-versed in Mokena history will definitely know the Schubert family name, as the son of Andreas and Margaret was John Schubert, who once again, during the Civil War years, established a hardware store in Mokena on Front Street. He built his building in 1862, came to be a pretty prominent resident of Mokena in his time, went on to become a police magistrate, even became a dealer of steamship tickets to and from Europe in Mokena, an agent for one of the big steamship lines. Towards the end of the 1880s, maybe early 1890s, John Schubert went to Chicago, where he became a real estate man, lived to be very, very old, and died in the 1920s, in 1927, when he was well into his 90s. Unfortunately, Chicago kept him. He never made it back to Mokena. But his brother, Nicholas Schubert, younger brother, is also interred in this lot here. This being the monument of Nicholas Schubert, born in 1840. So he's only 7 years old when his family came to America. And about 1870 or so, he came off the farm and established a saloon and an inn in Mokena on Front Street, in a building that was on the northwest corner of Front Street and Division Street. And he called it the Union Hotel, Nicholas Schubert did. And here is a letterhead from his establishment with his signature. Nicholas Schubert. I think this bears the date of 1879. So he'd been in business for almost 10 years at that point. Pretty successful man. He was known to host dances, balls, things like this at the saloon. And he lost his wife in 1882 to what then was called brain inflammation, or nowadays we would call encephalitis. Caroline Schubert, and she's right here in the family plot next to Nicholas. And Nicholas himself, this is really a reflection of the hard life that our forefathers lived. Nicholas only lived to be 52 years old. He died in 1892, the year before the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, buried here under this it's kind of a unique monument. I haven't seen too many that look like this. But to show you how steeped how steeped Nicholas Schubert was in his own heritage, in where he came from. At the time he died in the 1890s, he was a subscriber to a German language newspaper, of which there were quite a few in Chicago still at the time. And it's just interesting to me that he left the place of his birth when he was 7 years old, but he still, at that time, well into adulthood, was he was taking a paper that was written in his native tongue. So that's yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff. A good reflection of the heritage of the founders of the St. Mary Parish. And on that note, our next family we're going to talk about isn't German. So they're the first ones today. So they're just right over here.
Hey, Matt, can
Yes.
you, real quick, there's a couple on the ground. Is there anything you can just say real quick about these? Or
Yeah, let's see. Yes, these graves that are right in here, was this a Schubert too? Okay, now I remember. Nothing's coming to mind on this grave. This is, I believe this was a child of the Carroll family. I can't remember the year. I believe this says 1869. So it's one of the older ones, less than 10 years after the parish was established. The Carrolls were Irish, but they weren't, I kind of get the notion that they didn't really stay in the area too terribly long because their family isn't really recorded on the pages of history that well. Don't really know too terribly much about them. This is, next to him is the grave of another Irish person, an Irishman by the name of Daniel Donaher. And he passed away in the 1870s, I believe 1879 or thereabouts. So they're actually a good seg into what we're going to talk about next, another Irish family. But you're probably wondering, these graves, these stones are basically impossible to read. I've been studying them for 20 plus years, and if you can believe it, within the last few years, all of the historic monuments in the cemetery have significantly degraded. I don't know if it's acid rain or what, but when I first became interested in the history of Mokena and came here to study the cemetery and learn about it, this gravestone, these ones, they were clearly legible back then. And that was only 23 years ago, 25 years ago. So luckily I took pictures so we can still see what they looked like back then. But yeah, they've degraded significantly. And so yeah, some of the Irish families right here, of which there were some. St. Mary's, I mean, they were called the German Catholic Church, so it was mostly a German congregation. But one of the prominent Irish families is just right over here. We'll kind of shift around. So this area right here. Let's see. Okay. So behold the plot of the Luellen family. Luellen. The Luellens came from County Cork, Ireland, and in all likelihood, they were one of the founding 9 families of St. Mary's as well. The prominent members were Patrick Luellen and Thomas Luellen, with Thomas being the elder of the two. Like so many of the families here of St. Mary's, they got here to this area in the 1840s, about 1848, and they bought property directly from the United States government, who were the owners at the time. Brothers Thomas and Patrick Luellen had adjoining farms right next door to each other along the road that today we call Orland Parkway, which is just a tad over the border into what today we would consider Orland Park, but nevertheless, it's still Will County, and it's just barely, though, just barely. The Luellen brothers did pretty well for themselves. Thomas became, he was a rope maker on the side and was one of the pioneering owners of property along Front Street, having purchased a lot right about where the Chamber of Commerce office is nowadays, back in the 1850s, which was not long at all after the street was first subdivided by Allen Denny, as we know. What exactly he was doing with that property is a mystery. Whether he had a workshop there where he made his ropes or what he was doing, we don't know. But nevertheless, it is recorded in the Will County Recorder's Office that Thomas Luellen owned that property along Front Street. As time went on, Patrick Luellen became Patrick Luellen became very bad in terms of health. His brother Thomas took him into his house, where ultimately Patrick passed away in the 1880s, and he is interred here in the family lot here at St. Mary's. And at one time, he did have a very prominent gravestone that was, by one account, described as being about 6 feet high. Whatever happened to it, it would have stood right here in this area. Whatever happened to it, complete mystery. As we know, there's the Midwestern pastime of cemetery vandalism. That's probably what happened. But nevertheless, we do have an invoice that was written to Patrick's brother Thomas for the payment of the gravestone. And fascinatingly, or interestingly, whatever you want to say, the gravestone artist in Joliet who made the gravestone, his name was John Lennon. And he was actually, you see this name a lot of times over the course of history because he was very prominent and his work is all over Will County, including in Mokena cemeteries. So there are often gravestones where if you know where to look, like on the back of the stone, you'll see Lennon inscribed in it. So the gravestone for Patrick Luellen cost his brother Thomas $98, which in today's money equals about $4,000. So you can tell, this was, Thomas really thought a lot of his brother, really loved his brother if he was willing to spend the equivalent of $4,000 of getting him a gravestone here in St. Mary's. Yeah, absolutely. Just the business invoice for the taking care of the gravestone.
Was he ever married, or was he a single man?
Oh, good question. I'm sorry. Yes, Patrick Luellen was a bachelor. He never got married. So that's why, for example, his brother took care of him when he got sick. His brother, his brother bought the and paid for the gravestone, etc., etc. But there's still another pretty interesting grave in the Luellen plot here, and that's for Henry Luellen, who we don't know 100% for sure, but in all likelihood was the father of Thomas and Patrick. And this is only the top part of Henry Llewellyn's gravestone. At one point, it would have been considerably taller, but something happened to the bottom of it, and this is all that remains today. But Henry Llewellyn was born, once again, in County Cork in Ireland in 1791, which makes him one of the oldest people here at St. Mary's. We do have a handful of people from the 1700s. We do have some members of the Cole family who are farther that way who were about the same age as Henry Llewellyn. But you'll notice in the marker here, there's the inscription IHS, which is the Latin abbreviation for Jesus, Savior of Mankind. And something else that's interesting about Henry Llewellyn is that he died towards the end of 1864. And as we know, the cemetery didn't exist until September of 1865. There are a handful of graves in this cemetery that have dates on them that predate the establishment of the cemetery. We have the same thing over in St. John's Cemetery on Wolf Road, which is only a few years older than this cemetery. And what we know for a historical fact that happened in St. John's is that once their cemetery got established, some of the families had graves moved from Denny Cemetery, or Pioneer Cemetery as we call it on Wolf Road, into the church cemetery once it got established. So I'm kind of thinking that's probably what happened here too. My guess is that Henry Llewellyn was originally buried somewhere else, be it in Denny Cemetery or maybe even on a family plot on their property that no longer exists anymore, and that once they got their parish established, their cemetery established here, he was moved, and thus the rest of the family members over time would come to join him. There is a grave in this cemetery right over here by these branches that are on the ground over there that bears the date of 1861. So once again, that one's a mystery. Never been able to find any information on the man as to where he came from. what his story was, anything like that. Very interesting. But I will, I'll leave us with one final story of another interesting one. Actually, well, almost. I was going to say the most recent story that we'll talk about today, but that's not true. Mr. Hayden was from the World War II era, so let's go back to 1918 once again. World War I is about to end. In October of that year, the Spanish flu hit Mokena, which was in the news a lot during the COVID days, a lot of comparisons going back to that. It first appeared, yes, in October 1918, and lots of people in Mokena got the virus. Of course, the population was only a few hundred at the time. There were people in town who died from it, people in the surrounding farms outside of town who died from it. But the flu, the Spanish flu, when it got here, hit a, how would I describe this? A railroad encampment outside of town particularly hard. This was a group of Mexican laborers for the Rock Island Railroad, as back then the railroad employed lots of people from Mexico to work on the railroad. And they did not live in town. They lived in converted boxcars on a siding a little ways east of town, little ways outside. And when the flu hit this encampment they lived in, 6 of them died, one right after the other, in rapid succession. And they had no family here. They had no one to take care of them here, anything like this. So Father Theodore of St. Mary's took it upon himself. He said, you can bring them here. We can bury them at St. Mary's. So the 6 of them are interred on these grounds somewhere. They never had any gravestones put over them. And we really don't know too much about them. I have looked at the sacramental records, the church registry for people that have been buried in the cemetery, and I found them, but their names are very difficult to read. Everything is handwritten. So we don't even really know what their names were. But that is the connection to St. Mary's, the cemetery, and the dreaded Spanish flu of 1918. I will take questions if anybody has any questions about anything, or if anybody is curious about any particular grave. Yes, Teresa.
An organization, I thought, of people that were coming.
That's a good question. So the question was there an organization that was coming in and taking care of these older, more historic monuments at one point? And I don't believe it was an organization. As far as I can remember, it was just one man. A gentleman, some of us might remember him, a gentleman by the name of Joe Sursnick, who was a Mokenaian, very, very nice guy. He has since passed away, unfortunately, and is in the newer part of the cemetery down there. He was a man who was very interested in history and took it upon himself to care for old and historic cemeteries. His work is in almost every old cemetery around here. He was the one who put these sticks behind the markers, to kind of support them and stuff like that. He glued a lot of the old ones back together. He put like little statues by some of them, things like that. I wonder if that's who you might be thinking of. That could very well be that it was an organization, because I know there was an outfit or a group that within the past few years came to Denny Cemetery, Pioneer Cemetery, and professionally repaired a lot of those historic gravestones, and they also worked in St. John's as well. So it could very well be that they were here, and I just never heard anything of it. It could very well be, yeah. Hopefully they were, because I think a lot of the historic monuments and gravestones in the cemetery could use extra care. So, yeah. But thank you, Teresa. That was a very good question. Absolutely. Does anyone have any more? Yes, Ashley.
Hold on a second. Hold on.
Hold on. Yes.
Can you ask again?
Oh.
Go ahead.
Just the gravestone right in front of you.
Yes, very good question. So this is the grave of Anton Fulman, who was an older brother of Henry Fulman, who we saw a little back yonder. This area right here is the Fulman family plot right in front of the Luellens. So Anton Fulman, we don't know too terribly much about him, other than that he was just a member of the family. I believe he was born in the 1830s. I want to say around 1836 or so, and that he died, if I'm not mistaken, in the 1860s. So he would have been one of the earlier interments here at the cemetery. And somewhere in this immediate area is also buried his father, Bernard, who was the builder of the original church. But once again, whose gravestone is long since vanished. If he ever even had one, maybe the family never bought one. But yeah, this is kind of a rare marker for here in that it's bigger and that has stayed intact and upright over the years. Yeah, but very good question. Absolutely, absolutely. Oh,
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay.
My only question is,
yes. The cemetery records are not kept by the county. They actually are all kept by the church, and luckily the church has their what are called their sacramental records. So the records going back to the founding of the church of baptisms, marriages, deaths, things like that. I have seen them. Unfortunately, they are very, very bare bones, and they don't carry hardly any information at all. For example, a death record, and it's all in Latin too, is handwritten in Latin, is a name, death date, and that's it. Whereas luckily other churches in Mokena have been much more detailed in their record keeping. But still what the church has today and what has survived over the years is still better than nothing. And there is, allegedly in existence, there is a map that shows the ownership of the different plots in the entire cemetery, including the this historic part. Unfortunately, have never seen it, but if it's out there, I would love to see it someday. But yeah, very good question. Absolutely. But yeah, the county does keep things like property records. And in fact, at the Will County Recorder's Office, I found the deed, or whatever the term is, for when Matthias and Margaret Enders donated their property to the bishop in Chicago. So that's recorded in the county. Also, once again, the Schmidt family, who were one of the first 9 families, they also donated a little piece of this property that adjoined the Enderses to the bishop as well. And that had been completely forgotten about until I just tripped over that at the county archives. So, yeah, but very good question. Absolutely. Yes, please. Oh, that's a very, very good question. So the question was, how far back do death certificates go in Will County? I believe the county started keeping records of death certificates in, I want to say, 1877. So that would be 13 years after the establishment of the church and 12 years after the establishment of the cemetery. And I haven't seen one that old in quite a while, so I can't remember if at that point if death certificates even listed a place of burial. They do now, but I can't remember. Yeah, I haven't seen one of the really old ones in a while, so I can't remember if that's recorded on there. But yeah, to answer your question, I think it's 1877 is when Will County started legally mandating the filing of death certificates. Absolutely, yeah, great question. Yes, Teresa.
so how does,
Yeah, as far as I can tell, the question was how did these family plots, standing on a grave, how did these family plots come about? And as far as I can tell, it was just that at some point, very, very early on, the cemetery was kind of surveyed and laid out into different lots and sections. And for example, the Enders family would have said, we'll buy lots 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or whatever, and then it's in their name so that down the line, if they lose somebody, they can be buried there. And then the such and such family bought these lots here, so those are theirs. Or sometimes families would even, you could sell, if you had a lot, you didn't want it anymore, you could sell it to somebody else. That we know happened. Thanks everybody for coming today. You're welcome. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you.
Eucharist is reposed, so we're good.
Okay, thank you.
So these stations of the cross here are all, from what I've been told, original to the original church. They're from the 1800s, and they're German paintings.
And when were the windows done? Do you remember?
Just this past year.
Oh, okay. Wow, this is so cool.
And then, for lack of a better word, that is like a lazy Susan. So you can, behind it is the host that's been blessed and consecrated. And what you do is, if there's an door here, they turn it so it's exposed, so you can spend.
Is that
your
top
time.
part
And then if you're
where the cutout is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Where the cutout is, and then the host is in a monstrance, a big beautiful monstrance. And then if you're here to adore, you're the first one here, you turn the table, and it exposes the host, and then you spend your time. And if there's nobody here with you, then you turn it around and you leave.
How awesome that this is available.
They had these statues restored too, freshly painted. I don't know how old they are, but those were. And then my favorite is Jesus taken after they took him down from the cross. Station across the places and you don't see ones that are like that ornate.
Yeah, wow. How cool. Very cool. Thank you, Frank.
Good map.